Diary of a CEO with Stephen Bartlett just dropped a conversation between Dr. K, Alex O'Connor, and Greg Koukl, and I'm so excited for this. More of these conversations need to happen, and I thought, as a Christian apologist myself, to bring some of my thoughts to matters about Christianity specifically, and some critiques Alex made, and some perspectives Dr. K made about them. Now, just a personal side note, I myself am a huge DOAC fan, as well as their Behind the Diary YouTube channel, because I love production, I love video, so I just want to put that out there, full disclosure. Now, for about the first hour of this podcast, I would say an unnecessary emphasis was placed on an explanation as to what happens in our brain with the subjective pursuit to purpose, and Alex dismantles it by dropping this.
You were describing Sisyphus being happy, is what you're doing.
Yeah, so Sisyphus can be happy.
Yeah. I mean, that's
Explain Sisyphus for those that don't know about the guy pushing the rock up the hill.
Camus, who is an existentialist, even though he doesn't call himself an existentialist. He founds this school known as absurdism, which is a word I used earlier too. And he tries to describe the absurdist condition of one in which you have all of these desires about the world, but the world literally just can't fulfill them. You're looking for meaning, it's not there. It literally, your desire and the real world are in conflict. And he calls this, the realization of this, absurdity. And he writes this short treatise called The Myth of Sisyphus, which is based on an actual ancient myth of Sisyphus, who is condemned by the gods as punishment to roll a boulder up a hill. And when it gets to the top, it rolls back down again, and he goes back down and he pushes the boulder up to the top of the hill. And he does that over and over again for eternity. The real torture of this is not so much the suffering of the pushing of the boulder, there's that, but the suffering in the knowledge that it's meaningless. Mm-hmm. And that describes the absurdist condition. And Albert Camus tries to respond to this by imagining Sisyphus being happy, and essentially as an act of rebellion against this condition, just getting on with it anyway and being okay with it. I've never been fulfilled by this. I've sort of always thought that this may literally, and I understand that there are people who could do that. There are people who could write the book. And I thought of Sisyphus when you said the person who writes the book anyway, because it almost feels like an act of rebellion. Because it's not, you didn't just say they still write the book. You said they write the book anyway. They do it despite, they do it almost in protest of this condition. Some people can do that, but I think that is probably a sort of psychological cope.
It's not a cope. It's a mechanism.
Well, right, I'm saying I think it's a cope. I think that it's not grounded in
Mm-hmm.
anything rational.
I don't know if it's grounded in anything rational. It's absolutely grounded in something empirical.
Sure, but again, you can empirically explain exactly why somebody's brain is doing what it's doing, but that doesn't mean that there's any rationality or truth in the thing that their brain believes.
Sure. Right. But I think this goes back to the issue of whether there's capital P.
Now, if I jump ahead, Alex and Greg explain the core pursuit of truth and why Dr. K's perspective cannot answer this. Check it out.
Sort of the ways in which people become happy, despite the fact that there are painful things in life. It is an attitudinal shift.
Totally. I think one of the reasons why it might seem like we keep talking across purposes is because I think you are offering an explanation for why people feel a particular way, and I'm trying to see whether those feelings are, shall we say, philosophically validated, whether they are those feelings are sensitive to truth. If the way you feel about the world is accurate. So I can perfectly understand that it's possible for Sisyphus to be happy. What I'm saying is that I think that the philosophical underpinning that would be required for him to be content in that condition is unsatisfying, at least to me. So
what is a philosophical truth?
It doesn't have to, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say philosophical truth, but I mean to separate it from what you might describe as like a neurological truth, which is to say it could be true that your brain believes this or believes that based on this or that condition. I'm saying that totally, but what I'm interested in is the thing that it believes. Is it true or false? You know, it could be in the same way that, believing in Christianity can make you happy, it can make you sad, and you can scan someone's brain. You can put them in an MRI scanner and scan their brain when at the moment they convert to Christianity and see that it starts going haywire.
But
nothing to do with
MRI
the
is not
truth.
going to show any beliefs. It
Nothing
shows
to do with the truth of the
neurological
claim.
activity.
Exactly.
Beliefs aren't in the brain.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in this.
I kind of agree with that.
So Alex, I think
I love that he agrees with that. It's true. It's true. I mean, this is the first hour and a half. I don't have to comment on this. Alex and Greg did great because it wasn't getting anywhere necessarily, in my opinion. But I do want to move on to this point here.
One must imagine Sisyphus happy, and I can imagine him and say, good for him. But
do you think
that
you would
wouldn't do
be
it for me.
happier if you believed in Greg's views of the world?
Almost certainly, but not because of Greg's views, but because of the confidence and satisfaction that they bring. I think I'd feel just as much meaning in my life if I was a convicted Muslim, or were I a Jain or something like that. I think I would find that fulfillment.
So the content of the theology has no bearing in your mind on the way a person experiences their life.
So
of course it does.
Can you
Of course
explain
it
that
does. But
just in simple
specifically,
terms? Content of the theology.
Well, the content. Well, you talk about different religions, and there's these different religions are they cannot all be true, as Alex has pointed out.
Yes, this is a great question by Greg, and Alex's response actually contradicts what he just said, because if the theology has a bearing on the purpose you would feel, then you cannot make a statement like he just did by making a claim that you would feel the same purpose as if you were a Muslim. Because Alex grounded it not because of Greg's views, but because of the confidence and satisfaction that they bring. Yet now Alex says this after Greg's question. Of course it does. So in relation to the context of the theology, now because the content is different, making a statement to feel just as much would be an argument from silence. You can't just make that type of statement just because of the confidence and satisfaction that they bring.
I have a question for you on that. This is a personal question more than anything. So I find myself in the same position as Alex, where I think I'd be happier, all things considered, if I had an anchoring in a religion. I think that's like a subjectively true, that I'd be happier. Mm-hmm. Probably just because it would close a gap of some sort. It would anchor me in some way.
Answer a question.
It would answer a question, and then it would give me more of a structure to my decision making, and it would mean that when I have moments of suffering, I'd have a solution to that moment of suffering. So if my parents end up dying someday, which I'm sure they will, I will believe that they are still alive and they are somewhere and they're fine, which will ease my suffering. So I agree with Alex in that regard. The problem I have is in order to adopt that view, I need to believe it. It's true. People aren't very good at lying to themselves. And also when you talk about, my friend in Dubai has had this experience. He now feels better. He could have well felt better, I believe, if he had, believed that Islam was true and become a Muslim. So it's the feeling itself people can get in a lot of ways. I know people that actually would tell you that they feel better now that they're out of the cult and they're agnostic.
Yeah, sure.
And the cult made them feel terrible. Now they're agnostic, they feel better. Does that mean agnosticism is truth?
So the presumption that you made is a presumption. We have to keep that in mind. I mean, the people that I have talked to who were former Muslims and are now Christians, very devout Muslims, they did not have the experience of satisfaction, fullness, and connection with God in Islam that they do in Christianity, okay? So we want to be careful that we don't
there
just
are people who do the
stipulate
opposite,
it.
Yeah, there's people that would have gone the other way, and they'll be in the comment section right now saying, well, I went from Christianity to Islam.
Okay, well, sure. I'm just telling you what I know of those people, okay? And I think it's a mistake to say, well, everybody has their own religion. They have their some experience with their religion, because I don't think that's the case. I'm not saying there aren't satisfied Muslims. That's not what I'm saying, or Buddhists or Hindus or whatever. But what I'm saying is there is an evidential element to the changed life, okay? And it may not be decisive. There may be other things that are involved, okay? I do think that for many Christians, I think you've made this point in the past too, it's the experience with God that makes the difference. But it's not that the other evidences for the existence of God, maybe philosophical type of evidence, haven't made a difference. Because I've talked to lots of people where they have made the difference, moving them in that direction.
The point there that it's evidential, that's a presumption.
There is something unique happening here. It's a very important point that was brought up by Stephen. The opposite side also has a great experience, sometimes greater when going to Islam from Christianity. Then one actually moves into the realm of comparing religions, their teachings and their morality behind their teachings. Then it goes further to actually establish what moral worldview is the most compatible. Now, see, this question first requires us to answer the question, does objective morality exist? Or is all morality subjective? Because when we compare both religions, we're essentially asking a couple of foundational questions that lend themselves to morality, philosophy, and truth. Here are a couple of comparisons under a couple of umbrellas. Now, umbrella number 1, truth claims in Islam that contradicts reality and Christianity. Number 1, splitting of the moon. Islam claims Muhammad split the moon as a miracle in Surah 54, verse 1 and 2. Now, no independent historical or astronomical evidence supports this, not even in other cultures like China or India that meticulously recorded celestial events. Now, we can also look at the denial of the crucifixion. Now, the Quran denies Jesus was crucified in Surah 4, verse 157, despite overwhelming historical evidence from both Christian and non-Christian sources like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, and the Talmud. Now, virtually all historians, Christian, atheist, agnostic, or Jewish, agree that Jesus was crucified. So Islam stands alone in rejecting it. Well, then you look at the corruption of scripture. We see, within the Quran, 21 times it's affirming the Torah and the Gospel, the Injil. And we have manuscript evidence like the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, the Dead Sea Scrolls that even predate Muhammad by centuries and match what we have today. Yet the Quran, well, more so Muslims, would actually reject our teachings right now because they finally realize that by the Quran affirming our scriptures, it actually in turn rejects theirs, so they have to say that it was corrupted, even though classical tafsir would not agree with them. Well, then you look at the philosophical claims in Islam. Allah creating people specifically for hell. That's how he makes people. So regardless of what you do, Allah made you for hell, so you will go to hell. This is in Surah 7, verse 179, that teaches that Allah created many people specifically for hell. And this raises questions about free will, justice, and divine goodness. Now, then we also see Allah as a deceiver in the crucifixion. See, because Allah making it appear as though Jesus was crucified, as it's listed in Surah 4, 157, Allah becomes the ultimate cause of global deception, knowing it would lead billions into Christianity. So if Allah is all-knowing, he knowingly created the very conditions for what Islam considers this false religion to flourish. We can finally look at the moral claims in Islam. You look at Aisha's age. Now, multiple hadiths, Sahih Bukhari 5133, 5134, 5137, record Muhammad marrying Aisha at age 6 and consummating the marriage when she is 9 years old. Now, this raises serious moral concerns by today's standards and contradicts the Bible's teachings on protecting children in Mark 9, verse 42. Now, multiple Muslims would say, well, it was the norm at the time. The culture dictated that. Well, it's not true. In 6th and 7th century Arabia, the norm was actually girls being 14 years old. So not only that, Allah being the lawgiver and Muhammad being the ultimate example, you can't tell me that Allah is subject to the culture to dictate his morality. But then you also look at the slavery and captured woman. The Quran allows men to have coitus with those that their right hand possess in Surah 4, verse 24 and Surah 23, verse 6. Now this essentially permits concubinage, rape of female captives, and this is starkly opposed to Christian teaching that all humans bear God's image and that marriage is a covenant of mutual love and consent, as we see in Ephesians 5, verse 25 to 28. Then you look at polygamy. In Surah 4, verse 3, it permits men to marry up to 4 wives, where Christianity, however, affirms God's original design of one man and one woman. Genesis 2 verse 24, Matthew 19 verse 4 to 6. And then again, we see Allah specifically making people for hell, which means there's nothing you can do to try and get to heaven. And this makes Allah the author of evil and the evil deeds those people would have committed, because that is how Allah made them, and no one wills unless Allah wills. So when someone leaves Christianity for Islam and claims that it's more fulfilling and purposeful, we can objectively analyze it from a scientific perspective, we can analyze it from a philosophical perspective, and finally we can analyze it from a moral perspective, where we see the atrocious things it does and rely on our inner gut feeling that require an explanation as to why the gut feeling is there in the first place, and whether or not a Christian objective moral standard aligns up with not only our guts, but also whether or not it is better for humanity, which is a subjective position we hold until we open ourselves up to the possibility of the objective moral teachings of Christianity. Because we also ask where this gut feeling comes from. And as a Christian, we will believe it's the moral law that God writes in our heart.
What I mean by evidential is that there is information that can be brought to bear that seems to be evidence indicating that the belief system is true. It's
is that
accurate.
a presumption?
I don't know why you would call it a presumption.
As in the evidence that Christianity is true from the increased sense of purpose that people get from becoming a Christian.
I think that's one of the evidence. It's a subjective evidence, yeah.
So it's a
Evidence of
presumption.
the truth of Christianity.
Well, I wouldn't build the whole thing.
But
just
it's
on that
evidence.
case.
It's contributing evidence to the actual truth of
think of it
Christianity
this
as
way.
a
If the story
worldview.
of reality is simply that God made us to be with Him, and then we find the way that God intends for us to connect with Him, principally through forgiveness and be restored to our relationship with the Father, and then that gives us, when we do that, a deep sense of satisfaction. I do think that's evidential.
So I would actually say that the reverse is true. You know, Alex asked, evidence that Christianity is true from the increased sense of purpose that people get from becoming a Christian. So I would reverse it. I would say it's because of the evidence that Christianity is true, there's an increase of purpose that follows when one becomes a Christian. Because when we look at what Alex asked, and Greg agreeing that an increase in a sense of purpose when people become Christians is evidence that Christianity is true, can also be applied to other religions. And that's why I don't think we can claim that as an exclusive truth to Christianity, because again, a Muslim might say, well, it's because of my increased sense of purpose from joining Islam that it's a line of evidence for Islam to be true. And I think the reverse would be true. It's first because of the truth of the religion, and you've then following it that the evidence for its truths would actually give you a greater sense of purpose in following something that is truth as far as evidence is concerned.
Popular questions we had from our audience. One of the most popular questions we had is, do we each have a specific purpose, or is it self-chosen, Greg?
Well, in my view, if God has made us for a reason and He wants us to be in relationship with us, each individual person has different capabilities, and fulfilling those capabilities that God has given him, general ones and specific ones, like I have my own peculiar capabilities, doing that is going to make me satisfied, okay?
So did God give me a purpose?
Yes.
And is it different from Alex's purpose?
I would say in the kind of the minutiae, yes, you're a different individual than he is.
And can I ask you a question that then springs to mind?
Yeah.
Again, I'm very curious. If Stephen Bartlett had gotten cancer at 1 year old and I died.
I see. Yeah. Well, then you wouldn't be fulfilling the particulars that God had intended for you. But that kind of thing happens because we live in a broken world. It isn't the perfect world. It is not the good. It's not the totally good world that God made. Something happened that broke the world.
What happened?
Human rebellion.
At what point in history?
Well, early on with our first parents, okay?
So the first humans.
The first humans. That's why all humans since then
What
have
about
the same proclivity towards evil,
Does that
which I
include
think is
other-
pretty much quantifiable.
Does that include other species of human? Homo neanderthal,
Well,
Homo erectus?
I know that's a question.
Now, I do want to stop here before we continue and first say this is a great response from Greg because that is what it boils down to. Sin entered the world because God loves us so much that we could make a free-willed choice to choose him back. But we didn't listen, and there was a result to that, but it doesn't end there. And that's the beautiful story of the gospel, Christ's resurrection, and what that means for us who continue to choose to follow him. Let's jump back into what Alex says next.
Question that a lot of people are discussing right now, okay, and where exactly do you draw that line? And that isn't an area that I go deep in, but I do think that there was an original progenitor to the human race as we understand it right now that has the image of God in man and violated God's commands, rebelled against God, and that had an impact on the world. Okay,
and that is why.
And so therefore, you're going to have some people aren't going to be, fulfilling all of the ultimate purposes that God has for them in this lifetime.
Just to be clear, children get cancer.
Sure.
Because, say, 2 million years ago, roughly, the start of the human species.
I'm not going to set a date on it.
Somebody rebelled against God's commands, and that is the explanation.
So, I do appreciate Greg's honesty and not going deep into certain matters like the species of humans, and we should all grow in knowing when we can admit that we don't know all things. But Greg dropped a very important point there. He said that the original progenitor to the human race as we understand it right now violated God's command and rebelled against him.
Just to be clear, children get cancer because, say, 2 million years ago, roughly, the start of the human species.
I'm not going to set a date on it.
Somebody rebelled against God's commands. And that is the explanation for it.
This is a fair question, and some of these details I haven't worked out. What about earthquakes and tsunamis and all those kinds of things, okay? Clearly, there is an impact of human rebellion upon the earth, okay? What the extent of that impact is, I'm not entirely sure. But this is why I use the word broken, because it's a rather broad term, rather than trying to identify every instance of things that seem anomalous to a good world, not the way it should be, so to speak. Okay, I think that's an explanation for these things, even though we can't necessarily itemize each individual particular instance and how it falls short.
Now, this response from Greg is fair because I feel like this is perhaps a moral trap that Alex is trying to set that actually steals from God to begin with. Now, when Alex points to the reality of suffering, like children having cancer, there's an implied criticism of God that allowing this must mean he's unjust, unkind, or perhaps petty. But here's the problem. To even say something is bad requires a standard of good. Now, Alex didn't say this, just to be clear. He simply asked the question. But if Alex's standard of goodness is simply human opinion or feeling, then it collapses immediately. And Alex knows this, because another person could just as easily feel the opposite. Now, I agree with Alex that childhood cancer is a moral evil, but unlike a subjective standard, I can ground that truth in something objective, which is the unchanging character of God, because God is a standard of goodness. Childhood cancer will always be evil, regardless of what anyone feels about it. Here's where the apologetic point comes in. To critique the God of the Bible, you must present him as he actually is. So by definition, God is perfectly good, just, merciful, and gracious. To imply God is unjust is to borrow his own attributes, which means appealing to a higher justice standard that supposedly sits above God. But if God is the ultimate standard, such a standard doesn't exist. But we can also see this as a category mistake. So since God defines justice and goodness, to call his actions unjust or immoral is to misrepresent him. It's like criticizing a square for not being round enough. The category is wrong from the start. So when Alex implies that God allowing suffering makes him unjust, now remember, if Alex implies this, he didn't say that, he simply asked questions. But if he implies that God allowing suffering makes him unjust, he's actually assuming the very moral framework that only makes sense if God exists in the first place. Now, that's why Frank Turek calls it Stealing from God. It's a great book. I highly recommend it.
As your explanation sounds to you, as I think both of them sound to me, and I don't know how they sound to you, Stephen, but the idea that the thing that we are most fundamentally confronted with, I think, on an existential level is suffering. And there's our own suffering, and then there's the suffering of others, and the seemingly meaningless suffering of a child who's undergoing cancer and does not survive it. And I'm told that in the face of such existential tragedy, I turn to religion to give us a sort of sense of fulfillment and a sense of explanation. But when asked about the mechanism of how, I'm told it's because at some undisclosed number of years ago, somebody committed a sin against God, and that's why your child has now died of cancer. There are millions of people who listen to this show. There will be people listening to this whose children have died of cancer. I wonder if that brings them any kind of consolation.
Well, I don't.
Similarly, the idea that, maybe it's some disgruntled angels who didn't want to come down to earth for too long, and so if anything, you're actually doing them a favor by killing them of cancer.
So this is the problem of suffering, as Alex is putting it forward. I would say misrepresents the Christian position, because Alex claims that some undisclosed time ago, someone committed a sin against God, and that's why your child died of cancer. And we'll explore this soon, but let's finish listening to his perspective and then give a overall explanation, at least my explanation, for the problem of suffering.
I don't know if that's bringing the kind of fulfillment that people are looking for.
What's your answer to that?
I don't think I have one, but I don't like people professing that they do have an answer, but when it comes down to it, actually saying something which I think will provide the opposite effect. And I don't mean this personally. I mean as a point of religious explanation. The idea that this
is going to bring comfort.
Everyone's going to get a chance to respond to this.
Sorry.
So.
The idea that this even approximates an explanation as to why this happens. I would ask you to consider what you find more likely if we assume that we are essentially existing here as accidental organisms just competing in a struggle for survival with no endowed meaning or supervision. What might we expect to find? And I would ask what you would expect to find if we were created with purpose by a loving God who wants us all to come into communion with him, but for some reason thinks it's necessary that we exist in this vale of tears, in this material world first. What would you expect to find? I don't think. And then look at what you do find. Look at what you do find in the natural world. Even if you just take into consideration non-human animal suffering, just an unfathomable amount of negative experience for seemingly no reason, not to mention the fact that children are getting cancer, as you say, and as you've already alluded to, there are evils that humans commit, like the Holocaust, but there are evils which they don't, like earthquakes and tsunamis and the like. Well, I don't think we would expect to see any of this if we assume that hypothesis. But if we assume that we are just accidentally existing organisms in a struggle for survival, not only do we explain this, but we also come to expect it. So I think it provides a much better explanation. That is not to say justification. The idea, we were talking about evolution, you said that the problem that you have with the Darwinian worldview is that it seems to say that it seems to favor survival of the fittest, and yet there are things which evolution seems to point to that we would morally condemn. Well, of course, because evolution by natural selection is an explanation for how things got the way they were. It's in no way a justification for behaviors. It doesn't even function that way. No scientific theory of why things happen are any kind of justification, any more than Newton's laws of gravity are a justification, a moral justification for the motion of the planets. That's, of course, it's not the case. It's just an explanation.
But
I just really want to drive home this point, that it has to do more. If you want religious traditions to do what you claim that they do, which is provide existential comfort for people who are suffering, you have to do more in the face of children dying of cancer than some reference to mythical human beings who existed or in a way that is completely unintelligible.
There's a lot there.
Wow. Yeah. So Alex is basically saying, if God really loved us, why would he let people suffer, especially because of something Adam and Eve did so long ago? Wouldn't the world look very different if God were real? That sounds powerful at first, but it actually misrepresents what Christians believe about God, creation, and free will. So let's slow down and unpack it. So the Bible teaches that God created the world good. There was no cancer, there was no death. It was a world of peace where humans walked with God. Evil and suffering weren't built in, they came later. So why free will matters? For love to be real, you need choice. God gave humans free will so that our love for him wouldn't be robotic or forced, but with free will comes the possibility of rejecting him. Now that rejection or sin had consequences. It's not God being petty, it's God allowing human choice to be real. Now think of it like this. If a father chooses to drink and drive and ends up in prison, his family suffers the ripple effects. Now the judge isn't to blame for the child growing up poor or hurt. The root cause is the father's decision. Now in the same way, our world bears the ripple effects of humanity's rebellion against God. Now again, borrowing from God to argue against God is what it seems like Alex is doing. Alex appeals to ideas like good and bad, just and unjust, but here's the catch. If there is no God, where do these categories even come from? If morality is just feelings, then one person says cancer in children is bad, and another says it doesn't matter. Who's right? Because without God, there's no higher court of appeal. So when Alex says suffering proves God can't be good, he's actually borrowing the very idea of goodness from God's worldview. He's holding God up to a moral standard that could only exist if God were real. So why can Christians call suffering wrong? Because Christians can agree, cancer in kids is awful. The Holocaust was evil. But we can say that not just because it feels wrong. We can say that objectively it is wrong because God is a standard of goodness and justice. At the same time, Christianity doesn't stop at explaining why the world is broken. It points up to the cross where God himself stepped into suffering, took sin's consequences on himself, and promised a restored creation without cancer, death, or pain. Now, that's not a petty God. That's a God who is just, merciful, and deeply loving. So the irony is this. If Alex is right and we're just accidental organisms, then suffering isn't really evil. It's just nature doing its thing. But if Alex is wrong and God is real, then suffering is evil and there's hope for it in the end. But let's check out how Greg responds.
I don't expect it to be comfort to anybody to say who's suffering from whatever, to say that there was a fall, okay? The fall is just the explanation for what went wrong and why there is wrong in the world. Like I said earlier, it doesn't matter where you live or when you live, everybody knows something's wrong. And the way they express that concern about something wrong is in moral terms. The world is not the way it ought to be, should be different. And then when you give examples of it, sometimes there's natural evil, but generally it's examples of moral evil, what we would call moral evil, okay? Things that people shouldn't do, okay?
That's why I particularly avoided those.
No, right. You didn't include any examples. But the implication is, and this is where, Richard Dawkins' famous statement that this is exactly the kind of world we'd expect if there was at the basis, no design, no justice, no evil, no good, nothing but blind pitiless indifference. Well, I actually think this isn't the world that we find, the one he just described. Yes, it's a world filled with suffering, and there's a way of explaining that, which you just did. There's also another way of explaining it that has a solution. Okay.
What is that explanation?
Pardon me? That God is in the process of solving the problem of evil over time.
The explanation for why the evil's there in the first place. You said the fall. And I don't mean to interrupt, but you said it. You've referenced the fall twice now. And the last time I tried this, it seemed like you sort of said that you don't really know. But if the fall is...
I wasn't giving particular details about the ancestry of human evolution
what
or
is
anything
the fall?
like that.
Historically, what is the fall?
The fall is when our first parents, characteristically known as Adam and Eve in the story, in the account of reality, rebelled against God. And when they rebelled against God, they disobeyed him is what's important. He had given them a restriction. They disobeyed that. And when they disobeyed that, they broke their relationship with God through rebellion. They broke their relationship with each other. They broke their relationship with the environment. All of that had these kind of cosmic effects. There's a solution, though. That's just the first three chapters.
Do you know what the command was?
Let me just finish the thought. Okay. The principal issue is rebellion or disobedience. Okay, there are different ways it's characterized, but that's the point, in my view, the disobedience. Okay.
Of what, though?
Pardon me?
Disobedience of what? Like, what was it that was disobeyed?
God told them not to do one thing.
What was the
Don't
thing?
eat from the the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they disobeyed.
Do you interpret that literally?
Pardon?
Like an actual tree and an actual fruit?
I do take that as a straightforward account, but that's not the important part. I don't want to get
So children
caught
get
up
cancer because somebody
Pardon me?
ate. So children get cancer because a few million years ago someone ate a fruit.
So Alex is trying to minimize the point that Greg is trying to make, which this is a straw man. Now you might ask, well, actually, what is a straw man? A straw man is a type of logical fallacy where someone misrepresents or oversimplifies another person's arguments in order to attack it more easily. So Alex is also appealing to a measurement of significance of what happened. What do I mean by that? So Alex sees the disobedience as trivial. This is once again an appeal to a moral superiority because he doesn't see it as a big deal for Adam and Eve and how they disobeyed God. So in short, he's stealing from God to make a point against God.
And I was like, what do you think about like Hinduism and some of these concepts? And he said, I can't accept any religion that says if you were raped, it's your fault.
Yes.
So that stuck with me. And so for a long time, at the very beginning, Stephen asked me a question, am I religious? And I guess I would say yes. So that thought really stuck with me. I think for a long time, I was an atheist. I think I'm still an atheist. I think there are a couple of other things that are a little bit unusual. So like people think, like in the West, we think that atheism, polytheism, and monotheism are contradictions. We don't really think that in Hinduism, like those things can coexist.
So he says being an atheist, a polytheist, and a monotheist within Hinduism can coexist. Now, here's just a philosophical critique of this and from the law of non-contradiction. At the heart of philosophy is the principle that something cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same sense. Now, if someone is an atheist who believes no gods exist, they cannot simultaneously be a monotheist who believes exactly one god exists, or a polytheist that believes many gods exist. They are mutually exclusive truth claims. But this is also a category confusion. To claim all three positions can coexist is to confuse categories of belief. It's like saying, I believe there's no truth, one truth, and many truths all at once. Now, that's not coexistence, it's incoherence. We can then also look at religious pluralism versus truth. Hinduism often emphasizes inclusivity, many paths, many gods, many truths, but inclusivity of practice does not equal coherence of truth. Christianity, in contrast, claims exclusivity grounded in reality. I am the way, the truth, and the life. John 14, verse 6. The truth cannot be self-contradictory. But he's also borrowing from logic. What do I mean by this? By saying atheism, polytheism, and monotheism can coexist, Dr. K is implicitly dismissing the universal laws of logic, which themselves come from a rational God. If logic doesn't apply to religion, then any belief system, no matter how absurd, could be considered true. And that leads to relativism, where truth dissolves entirely. Christianity grounds itself in reality and coherence, one God revealed through creation, history, and scripture. The Christian worldview insists that truth about God is not infinitely elastic. It's specific, consistent, and corresponds to reality. Dr. K's statements is not just generous inclusivity, it's a philosophical contradiction. Now, you can respect Hinduism's attempt to unify diverse views, but you cannot logically hold that no God, one God, and many gods are all true at once.
This is, to me, the question of suffering. And you've explained your views about the fool, and I wanted to let you put them in full before I asked a few questions. But the first question that jumps out at me is the question of pre-human suffering. We're not the first species to inhabit this planet, and before we existed, billions of years, I don't know if you believe that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, but billions of years, hundreds of millions of years at least, of animal suffering.
Yeah.
And that is experienced. They like if and you could say that it somehow is less relevant or doesn't matter as much, but if you saw me right now step on a dog's tail and watch it squeal, you'd tell me to stop, because you know that absent just the effect that has on our human situation, that's bad for the dog. That kind of stuff was going on for hundreds of million years before humans were around. That means before the fall.
That's true.
The second
That's
question,
true.
the second question I have.
Let's do one at a time.
Yeah.
So even before humans existed, the universe was subject to entropy, the law that all things tend toward disorder and decay, which is the second law of thermodynamics. Stars burn out, galaxies collide, and systems gradually lose usable energy. This is why scientists say our universe is winding down. So yes, decay existed long before Adam and Eve walked the earth. Decay in the universe is not automatically the same thing as moral evil or suffering. For example, a star exploding in deep space long before humans existed is not a moral wrong. Rocks eroding on an empty planet isn't evil, it's just physics. So the Bible speaks of creation being subjected to futility, Romans 8 verse 20, but that futility is tied to human rebellion and its consequences on a creation meant for us. The universe had physical laws in place, which is gravity, thermodynamics, nuclear fusion, that allowed for order, stability, and eventually life. Now, decay was part of the structure, but it didn't become tragic until there were humans here to experience suffering from it. Now, for animals, death and decay are not moral evils. They're biological processes. An antelope eaten by a lion is not a moral injustice. It's part of a created order. Fossil records show predation, disease, and mass extinctions long before humans. Now, evolutionary biology explains this as part of how ecosystems balance themselves and species adapt. Death and struggle are part of life's engine room in the natural world. Animals do feel pain, but they aren't moral agents. A lion eating a zebra isn't murder, it's survival. So their suffering isn't the same category as human suffering. It's real, but not moral evil. So what does Scripture say about creation before the fall? We see Genesis 1 verse 31. God saw all that he made and it was very good. Now this implies harmony and order, but it doesn't necessarily mean there was no natural decay like leaves falling or cells aging. Genesis 2 verse 17, for in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Now death is linked to human disobedience, but the text is focused on human death, not animal or cellular processes. Romans 5 verse 12 says, sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people. Now, Paul clearly ties human death to Adam's sin, not necessarily the whole biosphere. Romans 8:20-22 says, creation was subjected to futility. The whole creation has been groaning. Now, this is often interpreted as a cosmic effect of sin, but whether it's describing a new condition or recognizing the brokenness of creation as it is debated. Here's a couple of theological interpretations based on a view you might hold. So, young earth view, many would argue there was no decay, no suffering, or animal death before the fall. They see entropy and animal suffering as a direct result of Adam's sin. Now, old earth, or the evolutionary view, now I'm not a theistic evolutionist, I'm not that. I do hold to old earth though. But we would argue that natural processes like entropy, predation, and animal death existed before humans, but the fall specifically brought spiritual and moral death to humanity, not necessarily biological decay across the cosmos. And then you have some people who are just in the middle ground. Some theologians suggest that while entropy was built into creation, making stars shine, ecosystems function, it didn't become tragic until it touched humans who bear God's image. So a takeaway could be, that the Bible doesn't explicitly state that animals wouldn't decay before the fall. What it does teach is that human death and brokenness are directly tied to Adam's sin. Creation shares in the consequences of that rebellion, and the ultimate hope is a restored creation with no decay, as we see in Revelation 21 verse 4. So in other words, before the fall, entropy may have existed as a physical law, but it wasn't experienced as evil. Only when humanity entered into sin did decay and suffering become tied to moral consequences.
Part of the problem comes when you create a world in a certain way that has certain cause and effect kind of things. So pain is there for a reason. Pain is there so that you can avoid something that's harmful to the body. When you start feeling pain, you withdraw from it, okay, in a very simplistic sense. It also has a downside. And the downside is that pain is painful, and sometimes dying is very painful too. So there's a trade-off there. Now, I haven't worked all those details out, okay? But what I look at is a larger picture because I can't refine all of those things for my own thinking. The larger picture is we all live in the same world that is filled with pain and suffering. So then the question is, who has the best explanation writ large about how that works? No explanation, well, maybe some, are going to go very granular and get here's why your baby is suffering in this moment for this thing. We're not going to be able to do that. But we can understand why the world is broken. Now, if you don't hold that the world was made for something better, then the world we see right now is not broken. It's just the way it is. There is no moral assessment whatsoever that we can make that would make any sense. Yeah. But we constantly make moral assessments, which is why you're bringing this issue up about suffering.
I've been very careful to avoid moral language for precisely this reason.
Let me explain it seems to me that you are kind of smuggling in moral categories with the suffering issue. Because if I said, I don't care about the suffering of millions of years of organisms that had experienced pain, that kind of casts me in a kind of a negative moral light. You don't have to say that. It does seem to me that you're smuggling in the notion that suffering is bad morally.
I know that people often do that. I'm specifically avoiding that because I've had this conversation 100,000 times, and that's the accusation that gets brought up. And some people do that, but I'm specifically, you can rewind the tape, I make great pains. I don't say the problem of evil, for example. I say the problem of suffering. Okay. If you said that you didn't care about suffering, I would say that you're probably just being inconsistent with your Christian worldview, for example. I wouldn't say that you're doing anything immoral in the context of this conversation.
So I'll accept the qualification.
So Alex can say he doesn't want to bring the concept of morality into the conversation all he wants, but so this is a subjective thing, right? My subjective gut feeling is telling me that he knows that facing this with a moral concept would bring him to a conclusion that nothing can be justifiable, objectively, morally good or bad, and he doesn't like that. But that's my subjective opinion, and maybe I am wrong.
If Christianity were true, we would not expect the kind of suffering that is present in the natural world. I'm not saying that on my worldview that suffering is wrong and must be fixed and there's some moral element. I'm not saying that at all. All I'm saying is that it is unexpected, if Christianity were true, that suffering would be as it is. Well, the way in particular, the non-human animals.
No, I understand that. Okay, and the way I'm looking at it.
But do you understand that I'm not smuggling in those moral? Sorry? Because you said that I'm smuggling in moral terminology.
No, okay, and I buy that. It's okay. All right, I understand your point.
Okay. Before he goes on to that, he says, if Christianity were true, he would not expect the kind of suffering that is present in the natural world, in particular, the non-human suffering. So he says, if Christianity were true, he wouldn't expect these things to happen. Now, Alex assumes that if God is good, then creation should be a painless paradise from the beginning. But the Bible never describes creation as a static, eternal paradise. Genesis presents a good creation, orderly, beautiful, and life-sustaining, but not necessarily a world without natural processes like entropy, predation, or decay. Goodness does not mean absence of struggle. Goodness means the world was perfectly suited for God's purposes, including the eventual creation of beings who bear his image. Now, distinguish human evil from natural suffering. Because human evil, which is murder, war, the Holocaust, is moral because it comes from free creatures misusing freedom. But natural suffering, or, animal predation, disease, is not moral in the same sense. It is real, but it does not carry the same weight as moral evil because animals are not moral agents. Now, we're conflating these two types of suffering, and this is a category error. Now, we can make the argument that animal suffering exists. Ecosystems require it. Predation, death, and decay are part of the balance of life. Without them, ecosystems would collapse. The circle of life may be painful, but it also makes the stability and diversity of life possible. We can talk about animal consciousness. Animals feel pain, but not in the same self-reflective, existential way humans do. They do not wrestle with the meaning of their suffering. Their pain is instrumental, a survival signal. And then we see the stage being set for humanity. God's purposes included creating a stable, law-governed universe. That stability requires processes like entropy. A dynamic, evolving creation was a necessary context for the eventual arrival of humans. Now, Alex is making a claim within the Christian worldview. If Christianity is true, these things shouldn't happen. So he's essentially saying that, well, if God is good, a moral statement has to be made whether or not our reality is good or bad. Now, if Alex calls animal suffering bad, what standard is he using? Because on atheism, suffering is just the blind byproduct of nature. It isn't morally good or bad. It just is. But to call it wrong assumes there is an objective moral standard beyond human opinion, which only makes sense if God exists. So Alex has to borrow the very idea of objective morality from the Christian worldview in order to critique it. And I think the bottom line from this whole perspective for me about Alex is, he's one day gonna have to face the big questions on morality, the big questions on suffering, and how he makes sense of it in his agnostic worldview. But I do have to say this, this is my perspective on how the whole debate went. I listened to it up until the end. I didn't have any comments for that, but I do appreciate Greg, Alex, Dr. K, and Stephen from the Diary of a CEO, and I look forward to many more episodes to come from this.